And staying in the region for years, American and Western travelers have enjoyed easy, visa-free access to many African nations. But now, Namibia is flipping the script. In a move that signals growing frustration over unequal travel policies, the country is introducing new visa requirements for US and other Western allies. We begin with Nigeria. As the US mulls expanding its travel ban to 36 more countries, Nigeria has issued a stark warning. The nation says the US could face retaliatory action and risk losing access to strategic minerals in West Africa.
And that story was about 500 US nationals getting an order of deportation, meaning they need to leave Namibia, and they were given a few days to pack up and leave Namibia.
Personne ne peut raconter notre histoire.
And no one can tell our story better than we can. For a long time, they were the ones who said what they wanted about Africa. They were the ones who said what they wanted about the black man. Now it's time to say no to that and tell it like it is. And I encourage you to pursue this project, which we will support. We are fighting for Africa. We are fighting for the black man.
The impasse in the UN security over the question of Western Sahara is an injustice.
The announcement came without spectacle, yet its impact tripled instantly across diplomatic, economic, and cultural channels. An African nation had imposed a travel ban on American citizens. The justification was framed in neutral language reciprocity, security reassessment, and sovereignty, but the meaning was unmistakable: access. That had once been assumed was now restricted. In Washington, disbelief spread quickly. For decades, Americans had moved across borders with relative ease, backed by the weight of diplomatic influence and global agreements. Travel restrictions were tools the United States itself had frequently used, often with little expectation of retaliation. This time, the direction was reversed, and the shock came not from the ban alone, but from who imposed it. The African nation cited fairness. Recent policy decisions by the United States had tightened entry requirements, expanded scrutiny, and signaled distrust toward several regions. While officials in Washington described these measures as domestic security choices, their effects were felt abroad as exclusion. The travel ban was framed as a mirror, not an escalation. Africa watched carefully. The continent had grown accustomed to policies being applied to it without consultation. Visa restrictions, sudden bans, and shifting requirements had long shaped African mobility. The new decision marked a turning point. An African country had chosen to respond not with protest, but with policy. Airlines reacted first. Flights were suspended, bookings were canceled, tourism operators scrambled to interpret the rules. American travelers who had planned business trips, cultural exchanges, or leisure visits found themselves grounded. The inconvenience spread quickly through professional networks that had relied on easy movement. The economic implications became visible within days. American companies operating in the African nation faced delays as staff rotations stalled. Consultants could not enter. Investors postponed visits. Conferences were canceled or relocated. What had been framed as a symbolic response began producing measurable costs. The African nation defended its position calmly. Officials emphasized sovereignty and equal treatment. If access could be restricted unilaterally, then reciprocity was a legitimate response. The ban was presented not as permanent, but as conditional, subject to policy review and mutual respect. Public opinion within the country supported the move. Citizens viewed it as an assertion of dignity rather than hostility. For many, it was the first time their government had responded to external pressure with equal force. The ban resonated emotionally, signaling that African passports and borders were not secondary. In the United States, reactions were mixed. Some dismissed the ban as inconsequential, arguing that few Americans traveled there anyway. Others recognized the deeper issue. The ban challenged the assumption that American policies carried no cost abroad. It revealed a vulnerability rarely acknowledged. Influence depended on consent. As much as power, the backfire emerged gradually. American universities paused exchange programs, research collaborations stalled, cultural diplomacy suffered as artists and educators lost access. These soft connections, often overlooked, had long supported broader relationships. Their disruption weakened goodwill in ways tariffs or sanctions could not easily repair. The African nation leveraged the moment strategically. Tourism campaigns pivoted toward alternative markets. Partnerships with Asia, the Middle East, and other African countries intensified. Visa facilitation agreements were signed elsewhere, offsetting potential losses from American visitors. Regional discussions followed. Other African countries debated similar measures, not necessarily bans, but reciprocal visa policies. The idea of coordinated mobility rules gained traction. Movement, long shaped by asymmetry, became a subject of collective strategy. Washington attempted clarification. Statements emphasized that the original restrictions were not intended as disrespect. Diplomatic channels reopened, yet the tone had shifted. Negotiation replaced assumption. The African nation insisted on concrete changes, not rhetorical reassurance. Business leaders in the United States expressed concern. They warned that travel barriers undermined competitiveness, deals required presence, trust required interaction. By limiting movement, the United States risked isolating its own firms from fast-growing markets. The African nation's economy adjusted. While some sectors felt the absence of American visitors, others adapted quickly. Regional tourism increased, investment from non-Western partners expanded. The diversification reduced vulnerability and reinforced the logic behind the ban. Media narratives struggled to keep up. Some framed the decision as defiance. Others called it symbolic. Few initially recognized its structural meaning. This was not about punishment. It was about agency. The travel ban exposed a shifting balance. Africa was no longer content to absorb policy consequences quietly. Mobility, once controlled externally, became a lever of negotiation. The ban demonstrated that access was mutual, not guaranteed. In Washington, the shock evolved into recalculation. Officials realized that unilateral decisions now carried reciprocal risk. Global relationships had matured. Partners expected consultation, not notification. Ignoring that reality invited response. The African nation signaled openness. The ban could be lifted if conditions changed. Dialogue was welcome. Respect was required. The message was firm but not hostile. As weeks passed, the impact became clearer. The backfire was not diplomatic isolation of Africa, but exposure of American overconfidence. The assumption that others would always absorb inconvenience no longer held. For Africa, the moment carried symbolic weight. It marked a shift from reaction to action, from complaint to policy, from dependency to negotiation, and as the travel ban settled into the background of daily news, its deeper significance remained. The world had entered a phase where power was increasingly tested through reciprocity. Borders spoke, access mattered, and decisions once taken for granted now returned with consequences, reshaping how nations measured influence in a changing global order. The fallout unfolded far from airports and headlines. Once the initial shock of the ban settled, its deeper consequences began to surface across diplomatic channels, business networks, and public perception on both sides of the Atlantic. What had been announced as a firm stance quickly evolved into a complex web of unintended outcomes that no policy briefing had fully anticipated. Inside the African nation that enacted the ban, the decision was initially framed as a matter of sovereignty. Officials emphasized reciprocity, dignity, and the right to control borders without external pressure. Public statements stressed that the action was not emotional but strategic. The message was clear: mobility could no longer be weaponized without consequences, yet implementation revealed layers of complexity. Airlines adjusted routes almost overnight. Transit hubs rerouted passengers. Travel agencies scrambled to update systems. What had been a clean policy line on paper became a logistical puzzle in practice. Tourism operators worried quietly, not about American visitors alone, but about broader perceptions of instability. At the same time, regional solidarity emerged. Neighboring African countries expressed support, even if informally. The ban resonated with long-standing frustrations over unequal travel restrictions, visa hurdles, and the presumption that African mobility could be limited without diplomatic cost. For many governments, the decision symbolized a rare assertion of leverage in a system that had long favored the powerful. The United States' response focused on reassurance. Officials downplayed the impact, suggesting the ban would harm the African nation more than American travelers. Alternative destinations were promoted. Statements emphasized that global travel patterns would adjust quickly. Yet behind closed doors, concerns mounted. American businesses operating in the African nation felt immediate strain. Executives faced delays entering project sites, consultants postponed visits, contract negotiations stalled, while local staff maintained operations. Strategic oversight suffered. For industries dependent on face-to-face engagement, the ban created friction that remote communication could not fully replace. Financial implications followed. Investment decisions slowed as uncertainty crept in. Risk assessments incorporated political unpredictability. Insurance premiums edged upward. What had been framed as a travel issue now influenced capital flows and long-term planning. Within the African nation, the domestic narrative evolved public pride at asserting independence. Was tempered by pragmatic questions. Would the ban discourage investors? Would it affect diaspora relations? Policymakers worked to reassure markets, emphasizing stability and openness to partners who respected mutual terms. Africa's broader geopolitical posture shifted subtly. The ban emboldened conversations about coordinated travel policies, visa reciprocity, and mobility rights. Regional forums debated common standards. The idea that travel access could serve as a diplomatic tool gained traction. The backfire began to take shape in unexpected ways. American universities reported declining exchange programs, research collaborations slowed, cultural initiatives paused. These soft power connections, often overlooked in policy calculations, had long sustained goodwill. Their disruption weakened influence in ways that statistics could not easily capture. Media narratives diverged. Some outlets framed the ban as symbolic defiance. Others highlighted stories of disrupted families, delayed aid workers, and stalled partnerships. The complexity resisted simple categorization, undermining attempts to control the narrative. Tourism data told a nuanced story. While American arrivals dropped sharply, visitors from other regions partially filled the gap. Asian and Middle Eastern travelers increased. Regional tourism campaigns intensified. The African nation adapted faster than expected, challenging assumptions about dependency. Diplomatic engagement shifted tone. Private communications replaced public posturing. Envoys explored off-ramps without conceding principle. The ban, initially positioned as firm, became a bargaining chip in broader discussions about respect, reciprocity, and reform. Within the United States, the shock transformed into debate. Analysts questioned whether travel restrictions had become overused tools with diminishing returns. Lawmakers heard from constituents affected indirectly: business owners, academics, families. The realization grew that mobility policies carried ripple effects far beyond their stated goals. Africa's youth watched closely. For a generation attuned to global connectivity, the ban symbolized a changing balance. It suggested that African countries could assert terms rather than accept them. Social discourse reflected a mix of pride and caution, ambition and realism. The African nation refined its messaging. Officials emphasized that the ban was reversible, conditional, and rooted in dialogue. The door was not closed. It was recalibrated. This framing reduced escalation while maintaining leverage. Economic adaptation continued. Local firms increased regional partnerships. Supply chains diversified. Digital services expanded to compensate for reduced travel. Innovation accelerated under constraint, revealing resilience that surprised skeptics. The United States recalibrated quietly. Consular discussions resumed. Policy reviews acknowledged unintended consequences. The emphasis shifted from deterrence to engagement, recognizing that blunt instruments could undermine long-term interests. International observers drew lessons. Mobility had emerged as a strategic domain, not a peripheral issue. Travel access influenced investment, culture, education, and diplomacy simultaneously. The ban illustrated how interconnected these spheres had become. Africa's collective confidence grew incrementally. The episode reinforced a broader trend toward assertiveness in global affairs, whether in trade, finance, or mobility. African countries increasingly tested boundaries once considered fixed. The backfire was not catastrophic, but instructive. No side emerged unscathed. The African nation faced short-term adjustments. The United States confronted limits to influence. Both learned that power exercised without nuance could produce outcomes neither intended. As negotiations edged forward, the ban's symbolic weight outweighed its practical duration. It marked a moment when assumptions were challenged and recalibrated. Mobility, once treated as a privilege granted unilaterally, became a subject of mutual negotiation. By the end of the second phase, the situation had settled into cautious engagement. Flights resumed partially, exceptions expanded, dialogue replaced disbelief. Yet the memory lingered, shaping future decisions on both sides. The episode left behind a clear signal. In a world of shifting power, even tools once considered routine could reshape relationships dramatically. And as Africa asserted its right to define terms of engagement, global actors were reminded that respect, not restriction, was the currency that endured.